We're going up to where Hilbert Hall used to be. Hilbert was this interesting building that was built as a temporary building. And like most temporary buildings, it lived on long after its useful life. Hilbert extended across here. When we first became involved in the campus had evolved in a way that didn't seem to have any underlying order or theme to it. But what was completely apparent as we walked around and watched how things worked was how much of the center actually happened outdoors. Originally, the city wanted us to build exactly in the footprint of Hilbert. And luckily, we were able to convince them that, in fact, we would be serving everybody much better if we didn't build exactly in that footprint, and if we used the new building to create the circle of serenity in a more tangible way, and then open this to the west for sunsets and the views of the mountains and all that kind of stuff. The building is in 3 parts, and they're identifiable by color. The administration, which was the dark color, the dark matter, and then the offices here in the gray matter, the brains, and then the yellow, which was the assembly hall and the meeting place and the lecture hall and so on. I don't know, I can't think of a clever reason why it's yellow, but just seemed like the right color aesthetically. One of the great things about buildings in Colorado is that, the weather and so on is so beautiful outdoors. So you use buildings to create an outdoor room. So the building gently kind of encloses an area, and then this triple function of being a place for the administration, which had grown and needed more space, new offices, and then a place for a meeting hall. So those 3 functions then became embodied in the building itself. There are lots of little hidden things. They're angles in the plan of the building, and they subtly connect to the library across the campus. They focus at the library. I was putting in all these little things to make it interesting from an aesthetic standpoint. And one of the other things that we came up with was a pattern for the windows, which are all different sizes, and they're based on the famous published illustration of the red shift in a spectrograph. So they actually reflect the lines, the bars in this spectrograph. Well, one of the things I found so interesting when we were doing this was the modesty and sort of unpretentiousness of the physicists themselves. We kept talking about how this is going to be really great. It's going to help your, process and all that stuff. And they, well, we don't need anything. We just a roof over our head. That's good. Yeah, just a blackboard. We don't need anything. So you drag them kicking and screaming into a nice building.
There's some truth to that.
The lecture hall was designed in such a way that you could be sitting in your chair and look at the blackboard and out the windows at the same time. And then when you pull on these things, which are boat hardware, they're designed for sailboats, the cam cleats. All along, the building committee supported our efforts to make a building that was responsible from an energy standpoint. The idea of being able to use natural light was very appealing.
This is really just an upper bound on the scale of quantum gravity.
The other feature was creating a place that had the right amount of reverberance for intelligibility. This hall has very soft acoustics, but a little bit harder down low. The wood panels are, in fact, based on a Fibonacci series in terms of their spacing. The other fun feature is to introduce sort of the most primitive form of physics, statics physics. The forces in the trusses are illustrated by the diameters of the rods. We took the calculations that the structural engineer did and then converted them to the diameter so that you can actually follow the lines of force in the beams overhead. The other fun feature is the red chair. The idea of that was just to provoke tension among the physicists and so on, and who gets the red chair, who doesn't get the red chair, and we called it a singularity. And anyway, we had lots of fun, as you could tell, making places that were both functional and amusing. It would be important that the meeting spaces should all be exposed in gentle ways to the circulation and the operation of the physics center. That random and chance happening where people would be walking down the hall and hear a conversation and be attracted to that conversation, and that's how a lot of the good conversations happen at the center. And so the seminar rooms, there's no doors, and they're open to this hallway so that when you're walking along the hallway you can see. We lit the hallways with natural light. The idea was to have things be open all the time, and so we had to design a system for how the doors would take up the least room. We came up with a sliding door. The result is that they seem to, for the most part, be open. We had to have a double-loaded corridor because that's the most efficient way to organize the offices, but so we didn't want sort of endless amounts of double-loaded corridors. So there are these interesting jogs that happen that then also correspond to the lines that go towards the library. And then there are also little alcoves as you go along the hall, so that there are many places with blackboards to stop and have that conversation. And I think the vindication of that idea is that the blackboards seem to be continuously covered with fascinating information, most of which is unintelligible to me. But one of the things that happens when you're doing architecture in a building is that there were sort of special needs in hardware. And all of the little name plaques, the ones that were available, were so corny and inappropriate that we wound up designing name plaques. And we used an interesting ladder for having the wires connect so that when the various technologies changed, they could lay in new wires quickly. As you would come in, you're presented with this little glimpse of the outdoors and so on, so that in each place we're trying to surprise people gently and have you relate to the outside. And so that even if you're not sitting outside, that you're deeply connected to the outside. We're bringing indirect light into the space so that the lights don't need to be on. None of the light fixtures that we were seeing fit the wonderful nature of the building, so we invented this way of using an extremely inexpensive light fixture with an energy-saving bulb and then covering it with these little translucent panels, and that then cost quite a bit less, and they're original. Outside is this tree, which we all agreed from the start we were going to have to honor and acknowledge and miss with our buildings. And when we were cramming everything in, you could see how tightly it fit, and luckily the tree survived magnificently. It's doing just great. It was kind of an icon at the end of Gillespie Street, as I recall. And then, glory be, the vines are finally growing on the face of the building. This was the idea, was that this whole end of the building here would be green with vines. We were competing a little bit with Stranahan in looking like the front of the center. We decided to make a front that looked more identifiably like a front. Lines up with the end of Gillespie Street and looks like the front door to the center.